History is the thing that I'm mostly preoccupied with in my work. How can one reimagine and visualize African American history? Make that history resonate in the contemporary moment. In 1969, I went to see the Harlem on My Mind exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum of Art when I was 16 years old. And it was certainly the first time that I had ever seen photographs of ordinary African Americans in a museum. But it was a very controversial exhibition because it was about the African American community, but the African American community had had very little input. I had just gotten my first camera, and it was the moment at which I began to reimagine what I might do with this camera. I decided that my first project as a photographer would be in Harlem. I didn't want to make photographs where the photographer is kind of invisible. And the challenge of photographing in the street is to make it feel like the most natural thing, even though it clearly isn't. But to just have a real respect and regard for the person that you're speaking to, and to use that moment as a place where the people I was photographing could present themselves to the camera. I started thinking seriously about how to both visualize and reimagine history when I started working on the Birmingham Project. It goes back actually to when I was 11 years old. There was a book that my parents brought home called The Movement. It was a book of photographs of and about the civil rights movement. And there was one photograph in particular that when I got to it, just seared its way into my psyche. And it was a photograph of a young girl lying in a hospital bed, and her eyes were covered in gauze bandages. And she was the younger sister of one of the 4 girls who had been killed in the dynamiting of the 16th Street Baptist Church. I was pretty much the same age as the girl in the photograph. And that photograph represented all of the things that my parents had tried to shield me from up to that point. I came to this idea of wanting to make portraits of young African Americans in Birmingham who were the same ages as the 6 who were killed that Sunday. Because not only had the 4 girls been killed, but 2 boys had been killed in the aftermath of that violence. But which still left the work feeling incomplete because it didn't speak about the passage of time or absence. So I decided to make photographs of African American adults in Birmingham who were the ages that those 6 young people would have been had they not been killed. And then I paired the photographs, and in making these paired diptychs, I could embody 50 years in one piece, and also engage this idea of lost possibility, what these young people never became. In September 2013, the show opened at the Birmingham Museum of Art. And of course, for the adults, it was a very powerful moment because they could remember a time when they couldn't even legally go into the museum. You know, so the project had different layers of meaning and intention, both in terms of engaging history, but also opening up the space of the museum. But that project got me deeply engaged in this idea of how can one visualize the past in the contemporary moment. And so that led to Night Coming Tenderly Black, a recent group of photographs that I made in northeastern Ohio. The work is meant to reimagine the path of fugitive slaves moving through the Ohio landscape to freedom. The title of that work comes from Langston Hughes' poem, Dream Variations, and the line in the poem is, "Night coming tenderly, black like me." This idea that that blackness of night could actually be a tender embrace. I wanted to imagine, as if through the eyes of a fugitive slave, what that landscape might have both felt like and looked like with a minimal amount of visibility. So the photographs are very dark because I want them to have the sensation of moving through the landscape under cover of darkness. This idea about material blackness in the photograph, the blackness of the subject, and the overall blackness of the narrative itself is what informs that work. And they're rather large in scale. In order to fully engage with them, one has to slow down and really look into the photograph. One of the things that for a long time has been important for me is for the photograph to move beyond being an object to being an experience. So that project was the second piece of an ongoing history project in which I tried to reimagine and visualize different pieces of African American history. Part of the challenge of Night Coming Tenderly Black is that the path of the Underground Railroad was of necessity never meant to be known. So there is no one specific place that you can point to as being the place. So what I was doing was making photographs in the vicinity of where fugitive slaves may have been moving through, based on the fact that there are still standing several of what would be called Underground Railroad stations. So it's a reimagining of that history, not a literal description of it. One of the things that has been kind of central to my thinking for a very long time has to do with the ways in which museums can be engaged. And I guess this goes back to the experience of Harlem on My Mind in 1969, when people were speaking back to the museum, making demands on the museum. It was the first time that I realized that the museum is not a benign space, that the museum is an active space, that it can be engaged. And over the years, one of the things that I've tried to do is to use the museum as a partner in making my work, but also to get the museum as an institutional space to expand and extend itself so it's made more accessible to the communities in which they're situated.